All right, everybody. So our first submission comes from Brandon, who is a 13 handicap. Now, Brandon, what you're going to see here takes the club back relatively neutral. Club head a little bit inside the hands, but what's most notable is his hand path obviously gets very deep early into his backswing. So by the time he gets to the top of his backswing, he certainly has a flatter arm structure. Now, the problem with this kind of position at the top of the backswing is that you need a lot of rotation to really get these hands back in front of you so that you don't get stuck, right? The deeper the arm plane is, yes, you can shallow the club well, but you need a lot of rotation to make sure that you don't get caught too far coming from the inside. And that's really where his problems are, is that if you actually look at his hands here and then you look at how they react in transition, they just drop way too much down and behind him. And so now the hands get caught too deep. The club just gets stuck way too shallow and from the inside here. And so naturally your misses are going to be either a big block, in his case to the left, or a flippy pull draw, which he said he struggles with a lot. And so really you can see like the really high exit from the front shoulder. Trail shoulder gets very low. And obviously you can see the amount of flippiness he has to save it. So if he wants to get better here, he really has two options. Either he can keep the pivot the same, but then he would need to get his arm plane a lot taller and more upright. And that way it gets a lot easier to get the hands working back in front of him on the way down. Or he can keep the backswing structure the same, but then he needs a much better pivot to influence the hand path more out in front of him so that they don't drop as far down and behind him where the club gets stuck. All right, our second submission comes from Scott, who is a former Latin Tour player. Really good golfer, but there are a couple of things here that can get a lot better. He takes the club back, again, similar to the first player, relatively neutral. His biggest issue, in my opinion, is 100% just the fact that he gets to the top and the club just sets a little too laid off for the length of his backswing. You can obviously see his lead wrist is on the flatter side, doesn't have the strongest grip. Club face is a little bit on the weaker side. You can kind of see it pointing in this side of the shaft, but really it's the alignment of the shaft. In order for somebody to rotate better, one of the key variables there is that the club needs to be pitching back behind the body to free you up to rotate. In his case, this doesn't happen, right? The club gets too laid off. So obviously starting down, even if the club doesn't steepen, it doesn't ever really lay down enough. And so the only way he can try to avoid hitting a pull, which is basically his miss, he's got to try to stall the chest to give the club time to drop to the inside. And so you'll actually see this here. The club, by all accounts, looks like it's in a pretty good neutral position. What you don't see is how he gets here, which is much more telling. So at impact, obviously, he has to slow the chest down. And then there's a big time save of it, obviously, with the hands once he stalls out. The only reason he flips at it is because he has to slow down his body through the ball. And the only reason he has to slow down his body through the ball is to give the club time to try to drop to the inside. Because when it's too laid off at the top, he doesn't really have a lot of space to lay it down. So if he actually just got the club more down the plane line, the club would shallow out better. Once that happens, he has more room to now rotate and he wouldn't have to save it. And that pull miss would go away pretty much instantly. All right, so for the last student this week, we have Brady here, who suffers from blocks and hooks, and his pattern is created a little differently than the first golfer. He has a very, very strong grip, so when he takes the club back, it gets way too shut, and then he obviously compounds that problem by getting the hands just way too far across his chest in the backswing. So where the first golfer had options of getting the arm plane taller or rotating better, this golfer doesn't really have an option. The hand path is just way too far across his body. And the club face obviously gets super shut because of how strong the grip is. So by the time he gets to the top, the club movement is pretty good. And obviously the club shallows nicely in transition. But when your hands get this far behind you in your backswing, you obviously are naturally going to have the club face be very shut to try to make it work. So he ends up getting caught just way too deep, way too shallow. And you can see how strong the club face is here. This is a chicken or the egg situation without knowing this player. Either his club face was very, very close from the start, and then he naturally started to get the hands more across his body to swing more from the inside so he could start it right and hit draws to basically avoid a pull. Or it's a situation where, his arms were really far across his body, and then he's just hitting constant blocks. And then how do you correct the blocks? A lot of people online tell you to get the club face stronger, so he just strengthens the grip more and more to try to make it work. But now you're just way too shallow. So he needs a combination. He has no choice at this point. He needs to get these hands much more in front of his chest and working upright. And he needs a slightly weaker grip to make sure that the club face is a little bit more neutral. You put those two things together and he can bring the club down on a much better plane and straighten out that start line and the curvature.